Yeah, thank you for that nice introduction. And as you see, I have a co-author on this paper, Matthew Monger, who has been actually the major agent behind this project and the development of it up to this point and also going forward. So it's very important that he's on here, and he will also come up and speak to us as part of this discussion as well. And I'll invite him up at the appropriate time so that at least he knows when to come up. Yeah, so I think I can just begin here. So philology has long imagined itself as the discipline that listens most closely to human traces. Every scrap of parchment, every stroke, every marginal annotation, every errant stroke of a pen has been taken as an invitation to reconstruct a past moment in which a human being wrote, corrected, copied, misunderstood, or reimagined a text. Artificial intelligence, a term that still carries more heat than light in humanistic discussions, has newly arrived as an unlikely successor to this tradition. When AI systems learn to read handwriting, correlate metadata, detect patterns across multilingual fragments, and infer relations among documents scattered across decades, they bear in them echoes of the tasks that shaped philology from its earliest days as an academic discipline. Yet these systems also trouble the foundations of the field because they perform these hermeneutic acts without the interpretive consciousness philologists have always claimed as their defining virtue. If humanists are good for anything, it's their ability to recognize patterns, motifs, and tropes, and infer meaning from them. Sharing this work with artificial intelligence has the potential to shake the humanistic tradition to its core. This paper takes up that tension. Using a project that applies AI to mixed media archive of correspondence, receipts, notes, and printed emails, it asks what happens when machines begin to assume tasks that once defined the humanistic scholar. The archive in question becomes both case study and test site. It becomes a laboratory space where AI extracts, correlates, and proposes relationships among heterogeneous materials, and where the scholar must confront the question of how these algorithmically generated relations relate to the tasks of reading and interpretation. The goal here is neither to celebrate technological novelty nor to lament disciplinary displacement. Instead, this paper is intended as an early attempt at describing and constructing this new stage in the history of philological discipline. The aim is to examine how AI extends the philological tradition while also departing from it in decisive ways. We argue that these departures are enough to justify speaking of an even newer philology than those that have been developed in the past several decades, because it both depends on and settles the history that precedes it. The one person in the audience that I wanted to get that joke got it. So, to see how AI can be understood as a late arrival in a very long genealogical line, we need to look backward and with a critical eye, tracing the conceptual arc from classical philology through the new or material philology of recent decades and into the emerging domain of computational reading. Each stage illuminates a different dimension of what it means to approach textual materials as artifacts embedded in networks of production, transmission, and use. The disciplinary history also highlights how the field's developments build on what earlier philologists took for granted and thereby allowed to fade in the background as mere materiality, mere manuscript error, or mere contingency. AI revives some of these forgotten problems by unveiling them while also creating new ones that do not neatly fit established categories. Classical philology, especially in its 19th century German form, saw texts as windows to an origin. Scholars such as Lachmann pursued the reconstruction of an urtext, a single ideal form from which all extant copies descended. As a result, the manuscript tradition was descended and described and investigated as a genealogical puzzle. Variant readings were branches on a family tree, leading back to a lost ancestor. And the critical addition, the final product of this detective work, was a biography of this forgotten matriarch. But as all biographies, this story was curated for the needs of the storyteller. Material details mattered only insofar as they could be translated into textual information. Ink, parchment, handwriting habits, and marginalia were largely instrumental. They were the media through which the text was embodied, but were not part of the story being told. What counted was the disembodied text behind the manuscripts. This Platonic text was the linguistic and semantic content presumed to be recoverable once the contingent and embodied aspects of transmission had been set aside. This was philology as purification. Mirroring contemporary 19th and early 20th century racial theory, these classical philologists aimed to strip away the messiness of embodied material history so that a purified essence could shine through, unimpeded by what was seen as contingent or accidental. Textual instability was viewed as a problem to be solved, or even a pathology to be healed, rather than a central aspect of the continued existence of a text that demands description and theorization to properly tell the text's biography. Variance, most often seen as human error, haunted the margins. The goal of the discipline was to overcome it so as to tell the sanitized history of the text. The new philology, sometimes called material philology, that emerged in the late 20th century, interrupted the field's confidence in the disembodied texts. Rather than seeing manuscripts as contaminated outgrowths of a pure original, scholars began reading manuscripts as artifacts bearing their own stories that are shaped by vital agents of transmission, including scribes, readers, owners, performers, and institutions. The manuscript became a stage wherein the life of the text could be observed in history, rather than a degraded reflection of an ideal text that lay outside of time and place. Variants were transformed from errors to signs of life. Material philologists turned attention to codicology, to the social lives of manuscripts, and to the performative dimensions of textual transmission. They dissolved the hierarchy between original and copy, and foregrounded the fact that texts had always existed as networks of practices rather than as pure linguistic abstractions. This shift was not simply methodological, it was philosophical. It challenged the assumption that textual identity was fixed, stable, or recoverable. Instead, the material philologists proposed that textual identity emerges through use, circulation, and interpretation. A text can thus be seen as a product whose biography is continually renegotiated as it is performed. Material philologists treat manuscripts as witnesses to the historical and social worlds that produced and reproduced them in addition to loci where linguistic content can be accessed. For all its critical vigor, the new philology still relies on human reading. Its interpretative lens is broader than its classical forebear. It is also more attuned to context and contingency, but it remains grounded in the premise that meaning arises from human acts of comparison, inference, and narrative construction. The scholar remains as the central agent who constructs relations between texts and artifacts as the scholar describes them. Even when the material record complicates the idea of an original, it does not overthrow the idea of interpretation as a fundamentally human endeavor. This is, of course, not a critique of the material philological endeavor. It merely underlines the distinction between this phase in the discipline's history and what may be coming next. At the same time as the new philology turned attention toward text-bearing artifacts as the center of philological discourse, innovations in technology led to the digital humanities movement. Texts became digitized, available first on computers, then phones and tablets and any other number of other devices. The digitization of different textual corpora led to standardization of text as input. The input of majority of early digital humanities efforts was influenced not by the nascent new philology, but by the framework of traditional philology. This meant that the texts that became available through the digital revolution were precisely the standard editions developed by philologists, freed from their manuscript contexts. The Platonic disembodied text was thereby one step closer to achieving apotheosis. AI enters this lineage quietly but decisively. At first glance, its tasks and capabilities also resemble the most traditional philological activities. If used simply as an input tool for digital text, There is virtually no difference between AI and earlier processes. It can be trained to decipher handwriting, to compare versions, to align variants, to identify authorship, and even to date documents. But the resemblance veils a deeper shift. Used to its fullest, AI can be used to assess much more than simply the text block that can be designed to integrate all aspects of mixed media artifacts. Further, AI does not reconstruct meaning, it recognizes patterns. Its reading does not arise from understanding language, even at the most basic level, but from statistical association. It detects correlations that may not correspond to human categories of context, intention, or significance. When AI links a handwritten note to a printed email because they share a subtle linguistic pattern or an unusually similar envelope crease, it performs a kind of philological magic. It uncovers connections that would only be dimly visible to even the most meticulous scholar. Yet the logic behind these connections is neither hermeneutic nor historical. It's mathematical. This distinction is crucial. Traditional philology, whether classical or material, has always relied on a theory of mind. This is the belief that texts are traces of human activity and benefit from being interpreted accordingly. AI, by contrast, treats texts as data. It does not assume intention, authorship, or meaning unless these are defined as features in a training set. Its capacity for inference is astonishing, but its interpretative horizon is fundamentally different. Where classical philology sought the original and material seeks the situated artifact, AI seeks the pattern. It reads without embodiment of material philology and without biographical narrative central to the entire discipline of philology. Yet this difference does not render AI alien to the philological project. It actually extends it in unexpected ways. Material philology taught us to attend to scribal hands, to marginalia, to physical damage, to circulation histories. Even though it lacks the ability to understand and interpret them, these are features that AI can now detect at scale and with relative precision. AI magnifies the material philologist's attentiveness, revealing micro-patterns across an archive that no human could fully catalog. It goes further still. It detects relationships among documents and objects that escape human perception entirely. Its capacity to correlate, cluster, and classify turns the archive into an active network of signals. This is where the philological research done accompanied by AI becomes something genuinely new. By using AI to read a mixed media archive that contains correspondence, receipts, scribbled notes, multilingual fragments, you invite the algorithm to perceive the archive as a field of interlocking traces rather than as a collection of discrete items. The machine identifies links of date, topic, authorship, material similarity, even gesture. It reveals what we could call the archive's internal gravity, the unseen connections that pull the documents and objects toward one another, making them into a collection. Philology has always tried to map such gravity, but AI does so by different means and possibly with different consequences. The newest philology raises new questions. What counts as evidence when patterns rather than meanings dominate the interpretative process? How do we adjudicate connections discovered by a system that does not interpret, cannot explain its decisions, and lacks historical awareness? How do we, as humanists, respond when the archive begins to articulate relations among its components without passing through us first? These questions mark the tension at the heart of the newest philology. AI extends the historical trajectory of philological practice while simultaneously unsettling some of its core assumptions. It amplifies the material turn by reading details beyond human scale. It challenges the classical ideal of a recoverable original by revealing networks that defy linear genealogies. And it provokes humanists to reconsider what reading entails when machines become co-readers. It forces us to confront what happens when the archive, through the algorithm, begins to read itself. In moving between manuscript and machine, we are not abandoning the philological tradition. We are watching it mutate. In what follows, we shall introduce our current project and use this as a test case for how AI has the potential to reshape the archive, how algorithmic reading intersects with human interpretation, and how these encounters illuminate the methodological commitments that have guided philology for centuries. The task is to inhabit the space where logics of AI and the humanities meet, rather than to declare victory or defeat for either side. We hope that through this project, humanists can see their own practices more clearly by watching them refracted through the workings of a fundamentally different kind of reader. This newest philology does not end interpretation, it reroutes it so that we take on new partners in the hermeneutical act, and thereby change our practices and perhaps even our goals. In that rerouting lies an opportunity to rethink what the humanities have always valued. Starting in 2023, Norwegian antiquities collector Martin Skøyen bequeathed large parts of his private collection of ancient and medieval manuscripts and artifacts to the Oslo Cathedral School Library. Along with the donation of thousands of items, Skøyen also transferred his archive correspondence, receipts, and import-export documentation to the library. The gift carries with it stipulations that the items in the archive be made available to scholars and that the items may not be voluntarily de-accessioned. This project, tentatively titled Refragmenting Skøyen, AI-assisted mapping and analysis of an antiquities network, will consist of a strategic partnership between Matthew Monger and myself through the Mishmash Center for AI and Creativity and the Oslo Cathedral School Library, a publicly accessible school library, research library, and book museum. It aims to produce impactful research and at the same time provide a service to the library. The project that follows emerges from a familiar philological predicament, albeit on an unfamiliar scale. When Martin Skøyen transferred large portions of his manuscript collection and its accompanying archive filled with correspondence, receipts, shipping, documentation, conservation reports, photographs, and much else to the Oslo Cathedral School Library, he did not merely donate objects. He bequeathed the dense and heterogeneous documentary record of acquisition, circulation, negotiation, and interpretation. Like many archives of collecting practice, it is fragmented. This is not necessarily because it is incomplete, but because it was never produced as a unified whole in the first place. Its coherence, to the extent that it has one, lies not in any single document, but in the relations that bind documents and objects to one another across time, media, and institutional contexts. From a philological perspective, this archive presents a problem that is at once classical and novel. It's classical in that the task resembles the reconstruction of a dispersed textual tradition. It demands identifying witnesses, tracing lines of transmission, evaluating variant accounts, and situating documents within the circumstances of their production and use. It's novel because the archive is not composed only of copies of a given text, but of traces of activity whose significance lies precisely in their relationality. The project described here approaches this problem by allowing these relations to surface through sustained, machine-assisted attention to the archive's material and linguistic features, rather than by imposing order on them in advance. The first philological act undertaken by the project is collection in the strictest sense. Here, the project aims at the transformation of physical documents into readable surrogates, without severing them from their material origins. High-resolution imaging, layout analysis, and handwritten and printed text recognition function here not as neutral pre-processing steps, but as acts analogous to transcription and diplomatic additions. Each page is segmented into zones, each extraction linked back to its precise location on the document. What results is not a disembodied text, but a layered witness. Words remain anchored to handwriting, layout, paper, and any possible physical damage. In this sense, the project extends the material turn in philology by insisting that every computational reading remain traceable to its material substrate. This insistence matters because AI does not read as humans do. It does not know when it is mistaken, nor does it experience uncertainty as a cognitive or ethical condition. For that reason, the project treats machine reading as provisional by design. Low-confidence extractions are flagged, ambiguous entities are stored with multiple possible identifications, and human review remains integral at every single stage. This is not merely a concession to technical limitation, it's a philological stance. The archive is allowed to remain unstable where stability cannot be justified, echoing the material philologist's refusal to resolve variance prematurely. Once textual material has been rendered legible, the project turns to a second philological task, identification. In traditional philology, this would involve naming authors, scribes, places, and texts, often by aligning fragmentary evidence with external authorities. Here, AI performs a similar function by identifying and categorizing actors within the archive. Crucially, actor is understood in the expansive sense articulated by actor network theory. Persons and institutions appear alongside manuscripts, financial instruments, conservation practices, exhibitions, and geopolitical events. The archive is thus read as a network of aligned interests and negotiated roles, rather than as a record of isolated transactions. From a philological standpoint, this move is significant. Classical philology privileged human agents, while material philology broadened attention to include not only scribes and readers, but also institutional contexts. This project extends that broadening by treating artifacts themselves as actors whose biographies can be reconstructed. A manuscript both passes through hands and exerts force over them. It generates correspondence, necessitates conservation, demands legal documentation, and accrues scholarly and monetary value. By allowing AI to surface recurring associations among such actors, the project makes visible the relational labor that sustains collections, but which often remains black-boxed in published catalogs. The construction of a database of such associations is best understood here as both a technical innovation and a formalization of what philologists have long done informally. Stemmas, prosopographies, and catalogs of witnesses are all attempts to model relations. The difference lies in scale and reversibility. Where traditional philological models are static and curated, the database we aim to create remains dynamic. New relations can be proposed, contexted, and withdrawn as evidence accumulates. The archive thus becomes less a container of facts than a field for hypotheses. This is especially evident in the project's treatment of provenance and provenience. Rather than assuming linear chains of ownership, the project traces overlapping and sometimes contradictory claims. Financial records are read alongside correspondence. Shipping documents are correlated with geopolitical events. Conservation reports are aligned with changes in description and valuation. AI assists by identifying patterns of co-occurrence and temporal proximity, but it does not adjudicate their meaning. That task remains with the scholar, who must decide whether pattern constitutes evidence, coincidence, or noise. In this way, AI multiplies the occasions on which philological judgment becomes necessary, instead of replacing that judgment. A particularly revealing dimension of the project lies in its treatment of translation, understood not in the narrow linguistic sense, but in the actor network sense of interest alignment. By tracking shifts in terminology, rhetoric, and descriptive practice across the archive, the project follows how objects are reframed to move through different institutional and legal contexts. A fragment described cautiously in early correspondence may later be presented with confidence. Provenance claims may harden into assertions of authenticity. Uncertainty may be strategically minimized. AI assists by detecting these shifts at scale, but it is the philologist who recognizes them as acts of persuasion, stabilization, or erasure. This aspect of the project resonates strongly with the history of philology. Classical editors often normalized texts in ways that reflected contemporary ideals of coherence and purity. Material philologists expose those normalizations as interpretative acts in themselves. Here, AI brings a new kind of exposure. Because it does not share human assumptions about relevance or plausibility, it often highlights inconsistencies that scholars might overlook or unconsciously smooth over. In doing so, it acts as a destabilizing reader. It refuses to privilege the final or official version of a story over its earlier and messier articulations. At the same time, the project remains acutely aware of the ethical stakes of such destabilization. The archive contains personal correspondence, financial data, and documentation of potentially illicit acquisition. Treating these materials as data does not absolve the reader the scholar of responsibility. On the contrary, the automation of reading heightens that responsibility because patterns can be surfaced more quickly and more widely than before. The project therefore embeds ethical review, anonymization, and controlled access into its philological workflow. This, too, belongs to the tradition. Philologists have always negotiated between the desire to know and the obligation to protect. What emerges from this project is not a replacement for philology, but a reframing of its scope. The archive, read through AI, begins to articulate its own structure. Relations appear before they are narrated. Patterns precede interpretation. This reverses the traditional sequence of philological work, in which the scholar constructs coherence from dispersed evidence. Here, coherence is proposed by the machine, but then evaluated by the human. Interpretation becomes a second-order act. Rather than beginning with the discovery of relations, it starts with their critical assessment. This reversal has profound implications for how philology understands itself. If reading has traditionally been the scholar's defining act, then sharing that act with machines forces a reconsideration of what reading entails. The project suggests that reading may no longer be a singular activity, but a layered one. Machines read for pattern. Humans read for meaning. Machines excel at correlation. Humans translate that correlation to narration and judgment. The archive becomes a site of collaboration between human and machine. Seen in this light, the project exemplifies the newest philology proposed in the introduction. It builds upon the classical concern for transmission and the material philologist's attentiveness to context, while introducing a reader that lacks understanding but possesses unprecedented powers of detection. It does not resolve this tension that this introduces. Instead, it inhabits them deliberately, treating AI as a provocation for further hermeneutical activity instead of an answer to our questions. In so doing, the project returns philology to one of its oldest virtues, methodological self-awareness. By watching how a fundamentally different reader engages the archive, humanists are forced to articulate what they themselves do when they read. What counts as evidence? When does a pattern become an argument? How much instability can a scholarly narrative tolerate? These questions arise from within the philological project's own traditional practices, newly refracted through the lens of machine reading. The archive, once fragmented by contingency and time, is here refragmented by design. Its pieces are rearranged, recombined, and reinterpreted in ways that resist closure. This is not a failure of method, it's the condition of a philology that acknowledges both the power and the limits of the newest collaborator. Interpretation is rerouted, redistributed, and rendered newly visible. Now I will invite Matthew up to talk about some work that he has already done in cooperation with Ernst Bjerke from the Oslo Cathedral School Library.
Yeah, thanks. We have already started doing some preliminary work on this, and AI has been integrated in the development and the application of everything. I've primarily used ChatGPT 5.1 thinking to generate ideas, coding, discussions, writing database structures, but also have consulted all other standard models to tell me what chat is doing wrong and to create discussion and influence my learning patterns. And I should just start by saying I am not a computer scientist. I have no formal training in computer science whatsoever. So everything that I've done has been a learning curve based on using AI as a tool to teach me to do the things, to find solutions that we want to have. The majority of what we've done so far is reliant on human-in-the-loop procedures. So at every step, I have had to learn what I'm doing and then relearn how to do it. And so I have not programmed a bot to do things or anything like that, but everything is reliant on active participation. And I think that's also part of the nature of what we're working with, that we think in terms of the philosophy of the human agency within the AI production. So as Francis mentioned, thousands of items were gifted to the Oslo Cathedral School Library. However, several aspects of the gift, including the cataloging and inventory style of the Skøyen collection, made it difficult to assess what that collection actually was. So the first big challenge was that Martin Skøyen operated with a so-called cumulative catalog. Meaning that in every manuscript that he acquired, he added to his catalog, but anything that he sold or deaccessioned, he did not remove from his catalog, which meant that he operated with a larger number than the items he actually ever had at any given time. And so that meant also that the donations that were received not always in the form that one would expect, given the lists and the donations came in different shipments and at different times, which meant that we really didn't know exactly what was there at the beginning. Now, the second problem is that there was a discrepancy between the published data on the internet and the PDF catalogs that Martin Skøyen kept. So there was no digital catalog transferred with the acquisitions, simply a web page containing data and a PDF file that was somewhat outdated already when the items were transferred. So the first stage of the project was basically to secure a solid backbone for the database that we could use to develop a hand list to see what could eventually be part of a full-blown catalog. For this, we had two sources, Skøyen's collection webpage, which is there, and a PDF file. So initially, I used AI to build a script using Beautiful Soup to scrape the webpage and catalog everything into a Google Sheet, giving me all of these fields of the manuscript, short title, text, description, and whatnot into a stable Google Sheet, and then developed a script to also scrape the PDF file, giving the same values. Now, from the web page, we found 840 manuscripts, but from the PDF, 12,000 items. Again, this is a cumulative catalog, and so when this is parsed into the units that Skøyen claims to have owned at some point, he comes up with the number of 20,450 manuscripts. Not all of those were transferred to the cathedral school. Now, the next stage was to build a database from this information. I used also AI to help design an SQL relational database to store and process the information in the sheets. Moving to relational database obviously provides a more robust structure and data infrastructure that eliminates some of the limitations that we work with when you're working just with tables. And so from there, then I had AI help me build an interface that we could put on the web so that we could make the information in the database more accessible. And the web page then showed us some of the things that we needed to then continue developing. So right away, and something that Francis had already acknowledged, we see discrepancies between the PDF version of the catalog we had and the web page when it comes to questions of description, of provenance, and whatnot. So we found that we should curate each data set as its own separate database table so that we're able to link data sets with specific information so that we always know which specific point in time is describing the provenance or the description of the item in that particular way. Now, there's also data saved on the Wayback Machine from previous iterations of Skøyen's webpage, which then we're also scraping to get other data sets so we can watch the development in the public-facing side of the catalog with descriptions within the archive. Secondly, Ernst Bjerke, who's here, curator of the library, also asked if it was possible to make a button so that we could see what items he had actually received. So we did that, and that actually worked. Praise the Lord. And we were quickly able to identify the 3,964 items that actually made their way to the library. Now, a final thing that we realized was that there was a lack of a final set of data that we would want to be presenting towards the public, because the items that are sent with SCAN are also sent with SCAN's description of what they are and their provenance. And scholars also would like to work on the items and to track the archive to find perhaps a more neutral presentation of the data. So we then also developed a research editor field that we can enter data in and then begin to prepare a complete, comprehensive catalog that can be public-facing at some point, that won't then be reliant entirely on SCAN's information. So at this point, we are well on our way to building the comprehensive catalog that we initially wrote as the first major outcome of our project, which is great. But doing all this has really helped us with the larger project of thinking how the archive can be constructed, because it gives us a backbone for a database to which archival documents can be connected. We have unique identifiers for each item in the SCAN collection, and we know which ones are held at the Cathedral School now. This will help serve as a backbone for the further work. We also have a set of narratives of provenance and descriptions that can provide a point of comparison for the information that we harvest from the archive. So once the database is fully operational, we can begin scanning and ingesting the thousands of pages of archival material, that much of which is stored in binders such as these. And as we have already mentioned, then we will use AI to read and parse those documents, identify connections to artifacts, and build a robust archival documentation before we use LLMs to read, identify, and create network patterns. So in the end, we will plan to build a complex relational database that will allow us to integrate language learning models to assess the specific relations that we find, attach them to the narratives that we already have seen in the public-facing information, and hopefully give us a whole lot of things to think about.
Just a few words here to round up. So as we can see from Matthew's discussion of what he and Ernst have already accomplished since we first began discussing and planning the project 3 months ago, AI has already been integrated as a crucial partner, yet it is not autonomous. The work of identifying objects in the collection and producing a catalog of holdings does not belong solely to AI, nor is it solely based on Matthew and Ernst's investigations. Rather, it occurs in the interactions between them. Each actor in this nascent network, Matthew, Ernst, AI, the physical objects themselves, and much else, participates in the co-creation of the catalog. The catalog, in turn, defines the borders of the collection going forward, thereby helping to define the objects of analysis. So AI's introduction into the philological discipline can already be seen. When the algorithm becomes a partner, it does not simply increase our ability to do what we have already done. It redefines the actual philological work by suggesting connections that it cannot explain or define. AI then dispatches us on a mission to check, interpret, and then defend its connections using both the philological skills familiar to us and most likely some new ones. It remains to see how this newest philology will look from our vantage point. We stand here on the threshold of a radical epistemological shift. It is important that we are aware of this change, that we map it, and that we attempt to analyze it. Rather than standing athwart the rapid introduction of AI into all aspects of life, or blindly cheering its conquest of our lives and minds, we need to take responsibility for its development in responsible ways. This is just what our project and the various other projects that fall under Mishmash are attempting to do. The history of that phase in the history of our discipline remains to be written. Thank you.